All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar, or whatever on earth they're called these days. My name is Dr. Oliver Robertshaw, and you might have guessed from my surname that my paternal ancestors came from Heptonstall, where they've lived for several centuries before my branch moved away to Haworth in the 1830s, up to Bronte country. Now, I came to inherit my grandfather's research, which he worked on a lot in the 1980s, paying a researcher to sort of poke around the area and find things in a sort of old-fashioned way of actually visiting places. And I'd say over the last sort of 8 years or so, I've really managed to flesh out a lot of his research, particularly the paternal tree, but not just the paternal tree. Obviously, there's some interesting branches off it. And I've managed to go back to about the late 1300s, varying degrees of confidence, and I've got about 1,500 Robertshaw individuals in my tree. Obviously, from mainly from these records that I'm going to go through. Now, I generally consider family history research to be a sort of a three-phase thing that we do. The first phase is to discover that people exist. So you find their name and a date when they flourished. The second phase is discovering, how they're related to other people, and ideally discovering how they're related to yourself. And then the third part is, adding colour to their lives. So figuring out what they did for a living, what they, where did they live, what do they look like, if you can know that, what are they like as people, and sort of ideally amusing things about their lives. And of course, as we move backwards in time, our search becomes more about, the first point, just discovering that people existed, and becomes a more abstract problem, which, for some people that's a good thing, and some people don't really like that so much. And obviously, like, determining relationships with other people can become a bit harder, and learning things about their lives, gaining that colour, can become an impossible task, as people just simply weren't interested in recording some of these details as you go further back. And obviously, to do family history research, you need to collect data, so pieces of the jigsaw, the never-ending jigsaw puzzle, if you will. And so I'm going to go through this. Some important sources of family history research starting in the 20th century, and go back to medieval times. And these resources are listed here on the Heptonstall History Society website. So this is hhh-s.com. And I'm going to start sort of at the near times and work my way backwards into the distant past. And obviously I'm going to try to keep this, this down to 40 minutes. So I'm going to have to move a little bit quickly because there's so much here. I'll try to talk about, where you can find records and what information they contain, i.e. why they're interesting to you. I'm unfortunately not going to have as much time to talk about some of the context in as much detail as I would like to. And of course, as you move further backwards in time, some of these records are actually sort of produced in a historical context, around a specific event. And, speaking for myself, actually learning about this context has made me a lot more interested in learning more about English social history. I guess at school you always learn about kings and queens, but actually it's the social history which I think is a lot more interesting and important. So if you do miss anything, you'll obviously be able to refer back to this website and the links. We'll get this uploaded to YouTube afterwards, and then you can, of course, ask general questions on Facebook afterwards. And I'm always happy to answer questions about 15th century Heptonstall wills. I won't necessarily, I will click through some of the websites. I won't necessarily click on the records themselves to show you, because I don't want to bring the wrath of copyright down to my head. Maybe we can do that after in the Q&A session if anyone's interested in seeing some, but I'll go back to that. And obviously at the end, we'll do some time if anyone has any questions or wants to discuss any sort of general workshopping type stuff. So, starting with the 20th century. So, for most of us, we obtain knowledge about immediate relatives through personal experience. So most of us knew our parents and grandparents, and perhaps we also, knew stories about their siblings and parents also. And actually the problem's kind of reversed here. We actually have colour about their lives. So we might know what they're like as people, but we don't necessarily have detail around where they lived or what they did. So, for example, the main example of this is that perhaps, in recent years, celebrating the centenary of the First World War, a lot of us are interested in learning about, what our ancestors may have done during the Great War. And so, the first thing on this list is how do you research, First World War records? And of course, the National Archives, if I click through, presumably you can all see this. the National Archives have a good resource here for discovering records relating to the war. The National Archives did digitize a lot of records for the centenary, and you would generally start with the index with the medal cards here, and you can search for name here, and using that information you can find out what regiment they're in, and knowing what regiment they're in, you can obviously find out where they fought, and you can look up regimental diaries, which if you're really lucky, they'll they might even name the person and say they did something brave or awful. Now, World War II records, I guess those will come up more in future, but generally more modern records are restricted at the moment because records are often closed if they're less than 100 years old. You can request them from the MOD through this link here, which I won't go into. Casualties and obituaries from the First World War. Czech newspapers, Todmorden and Hebden Bridge papers are usually covered from sort of the mid to late 1800s, particularly the Todmorden, I think it's the Advertiser, I can't remember off the top of my head. Local libraries have these newspapers on microfilm. British Newspaper Archives, this website here, is excellent for you can search it, and they've got some of the local newspapers, but not all of them. So you can obviously search for, I want to look for something, you can type it in and then you can restrict by date. So there you go, pretty easy. And this is a paid for website. I don't know if there's a free subscription in the library like some of the others, but it's not a lot of money. And of course, although these do give you information about casualties and obituaries, it's not all miserable. There's actually a lot of positive stories in the newspapers which are worth trying to find. So, often local people come back wounded as war heroes. Sometimes there's people organising food drives. Sometimes there's photographs of soldiers in there as well, which you might find useful. And I'll talk a bit more about newspapers in a moment. There's Census Records. I'm sure you're all aware of the two available for the 20th century, 1901 and 1911, obviously taken every 10 years. The next one for 1921 is due in January 2022. And then unfortunately, we don't have any more censuses until 2052, which isn't too bad a thing because we got the 1939 register. This was essentially a census that was taken on just after the outbreak of World War II in September 1939. And if I just fire this up, you can obviously search for people. You can put in more, registration district of Hebden Bridge and find people. This is a really good resource for, like any other census, is obviously good because it tells you where people lived and what they were doing. And it's also great because it gives you a date of birth, which helps you cross-reference with other things like wills, which also give date of birth. And I'll talk about wills in a moment. Well, actually, I'll talk about wills almost now. 1939 register contains a lot of living people. So again, I'm not going to click through, but if someone's alive in around like 2010 or so, I think roughly when they transcribed it for this, they will be blanked out, but you'll get everyone else. Wills, if you're interested in finding someone's will, they've been registered with the government from about the year 1857. The source for those is the GRO website, not the GRO website, the probate registry website. So you can search for these here. So you can put in a surname and a year. So if I want to search for Robert Shaw Wills from 1900, bish bash bosh, it gives you a list of them right here, and you can put the details in on the right here, and then you can purchase them, and they're about £1.50 each, and it takes a couple of weeks for them to turn up. I will obviously talk about wills pre-1858, 1857 a little bit later. The General Register Office, so births, marriages and deaths have been registered centrally since I think 1837. So those are interesting because births give the place of birth and the parents' names in most cases. So that's mainly useful because it gives a mother's maiden name. You might have encountered yourself if you've come across these records. Sometimes the father's missing or even misleading, so be a little bit careful about names there. Marriages are also very useful because they give the names of fathers. So if you've got anyone married around the year sort of 1840, they're really useful because it helps you go back another generation. And then deaths give you an age of death. Now, if you're interested in looking up these guys, you can find indexes to them on this website called FreeBMD. Again, another search website, so you can search for a surname, you can search for an age, date range. And if you're interested in Heptonstall and anywhere between Heptonstall and Todmorden, then you look for the Todmorden registration district. Oops, births. And then bish bash bosh, that will not do anything. Oh, there you go. And then there you go. This is the list of all the people born with that surname in this era. You can also actually go on the GRO website itself, and they've got an online index where you can do a similar thing and search for, a surname by year range. The GRO website's a little bit more useful because although you can't search for quite as good a year range, you've got mother's maiden name. So this is like a way of enhancing what FreeBMD gives you, which is really useful. And you can order copies through this website as well. And they're not particularly expensive. I think it's something like £5 to £10. I can't remember. Now, Electoral Registers, quite useful from 1832. Obviously, there's an open and closed register. There's some that exist from before 1832 where they were collected for wealthy individuals who are interested in, who's voting for who, but they're quite rare. These are useful because before universal suffrage turned up, then the property that someone owned, which made them valid, a valid voter, was recorded, and that can be quite useful. And these, you can generally find these. Well, you can search them on Ancestry and Find My Past, which I should point out, if you're interested in using Ancestry and Find My Past and you don't have it at home, you can go into most libraries will have a free subscription, at least Ancestry. I think Halifax Library has Find My Past for free as well. And then Halifax Library, I believe, has these all bound as well. So you'll find them in the local studies area. There'll be racks and racks of electoral registers going back to this era. And they're worth a quick look through. And then there's some other miscellaneous lists, so directories and ancestry, photographs. I'm sure you're all familiar with Pennine Horizons. And then church records. Not much to say for the 20th century, unfortunately, because for whatever reasons, they're not really transcribed a great deal for the 20th century. You can, of course, inquire with local churches where they operate if you're interested in relatively recent records. And then gravestones, which, I'll come to that in a moment. So those are your main sources for the 20th century. If you're interested in 19th century history, we start with censuses. So taken every 10 years, they actually start in 1801, but they don't start naming individuals until 1841. Sorry, excuse me. There are some earlier censuses in 1841 that name individuals. If you look on the Halifax Library website, you'll see, if it works, they have some later censuses, but then you'll notice, for example, Todmorden has an 1811 census that lists the head of household in Stansfield Township as well, 1821. And again, censuses are useful because they give you people's ages. But from 1851, they give relationships. Talk on a good way, using censuses properly is probably an hour-long talk in itself. All I would say here is 1841 census. Don't ignore information like occupation. And don't ignore people, cohabitants especially. Don't make assumptions and don't ignore them either. They're actually very useful bits of information. We have the General Register Office, again, as I mentioned, wills, church records. So parish registers start in the 1500s, depending on the church. And as I mentioned earlier, they cover baptisms, marriages, and burials. Their contents generally varies, and the further back in time you go, the less useful information they have. So, for example, marriages don't record the father's name before 1837, but between the 1750s and the 1830s, every single marriage in the country had to be performed in a parish church. So the the marriage records are useful to find, you know, ancestors. They get, you know, if your ancestors married in those years, well, obviously they did, they will be in the marriage registers somewhere. If you think there's a gap, if you can't find people, that's probably because they married in another parish, or because the name is being transcribed or written down wrong, or something your search isn't picking it up. So keep looking, you'll find them. And obviously most genealogical websites, so Ancestry and Find My Past are the two main paid ones I've mentioned, have these registers online, and Family Search is a free one run by the Mormons over in America. And I think that's partly why they don't have a lot of the later 20th century church records, because I think they photographed a lot of and scanned a lot of these back in the 1980s or so, and only went back so far. Excuse me. Newspapers I've already mentioned. So for Todmorden and Hebden Bridge from around the mid-19th century. Before that, you're looking at sort of city newspapers. Manchester and Leeds have a lot of stuff, especially around, you know, mill strikes and things like that. You can find those on that British Newspaper Archive website that I mentioned a moment ago. Related to Todmorden almanacs, they're quite interesting. So they started around the late, I've got one over here somewhere. When does it start? 1866. And those give quite concise overviews of interesting events. So if you're interested in, you know, what was this in 1872, pick up, find an almanac and have a look in there, and you probably find it. Also, lots of people named, and then lots of adverts by the companies of individuals. Oh, sorry, going back to church records briefly. Sorry, I was going to talk about graveyards and gravestones. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the graveyards at Heptonstall. Worth a look around. I've spent many a good hour just looking around them, but if you don't fancy that, you can go on the Hebden Bridge Local History Society website, and they've actually got them all. Here we go, gravestones. They've actually transcribed the majority of gravestones in the area. They've got a little plan here and so on. So that's a really good resource. There are other it's gone up here. Sorry. Other graveyards in the area have been transcribed by the Colesdale Family History Society. So they have like these memorial inscription CDs. So they cover quite a lot, and they've released a fourth one in recent years if you haven't seen that yet. These cover most of the graveyards in the area. They're obviously not all covered. There's a few that are missing. So for example, the one at the two graveyards up at Slack, the Baptist one and the one outside the church, haven't been transcribed yet. Hopefully, you know, some Family History Society will correct that in the near future. And then some others, like Wainsgate, for example, are available if you inquire with the church about who's buried there, and they'll have some of those records. Sorry, going back down to where we were. Trade directories. So these were produced every few years to sort of record, you know, a little bit of interesting information about the town and who the main tradespeople and principal inhabitants were. Again, you can find these bound in most central libraries, probably next to Electoral Registers, big thick volumes of things. I know certainly Leeds Library has a lot of these. Or failing that, you can go on the Leeds University Special Collections website here, and you can browse them online. So you're generally looking for West Riding of Yorkshire. Well, if it decides to work, which it's not right now, you can search them for names, and they're really useful. They'll oh, there we go. Yeah, they'll obviously tell you something about what a person was up to, and you might find something you didn't already know about them, because they do start before 1841. I think 1830s, 1820s they start for Heptonstall specifically. Military records, unfortunately, a little bit difficult to dig to find for the 19th century. I generally recommend starting with websites like, well, Ancestry, Find My Past and Forces War Records. They will usually, if you search for a name, they'll generally also record the parish where they came from. So sometimes people write Heptonstall, some people just write Parish of Halifax. So can be easy, can be hard to find people. Most original records held at the National Archives, and I think they've got they should have guides somewhere about how to do that. Pro tip: I found that if people get married in their sort of early to mid 30s, it's sometimes an indication that they were in the military, and that you should go out and try and find some records for them. Registry of Deeds I'll talk about in a moment. Miscellaneous records, Heptonstall school accounts, pretty useful. So for this sort of, 18 years worth of history, so they record all the children going to school at Heptonstall, and payments, how much money they spent on fire and quills and books and things like that, quite useful. So sometimes it's in the museum, and sometimes it's at Bankfield Museum, but I recommend inquiring with them if you're interested in having a look there. And then sort of other miscellaneous records. So counties are required by law to operate archives, and West Yorkshire is actually quite lucky to have 5 offices. And as you're probably aware, there's one in the basement of Halifax Library. Of course, they're gold mines of information. They will contain more information about local area than any other place in the world. Obviously, normally you can visit in person, obviously make an appointment for when they reopen, and consult their sort of physical catalogues. Otherwise, they have an online catalogue, which you can search for here. It's a catalogue website, and you can search for things. Contains the same information as the hard copies. And if I just do a quick search here, so if I'm interested in Robert Shaw's from Heptonstall, let's bash that out to everyone. Sort by date, bang. So they've got records linking them from the 1600s. So quite interesting. And of course, at the moment, you can, if you get these references here on the left, if you send those to their email address and ask, can you please obtain a copy, they'll give you an estimate, and it's usually not a lot of money to get copies of these. Of course, there are other archives, not just West Yorkshire ones. So Lancashire and Nottinghamshire in particular hold a lot of information covering Heptonstall for varying reasons. And then the National Archives website tries to be a sort of meta archive, and their Discovery website, their Discovery search engine, will actually search their own records as well as other participating archives. In theory, that's supposed to be all of them, and West Yorkshire Archives are quite good about adding their stuff to this, but some others are not so good. So if I want to search people in the 1500s, what have I got? Some stuff at Nottinghamshire, Barnsley. Oh, I didn't know that. I need to look that up. All right, so 18th century town books at West Yorkshire Archives, Halifax, are an absolute goldmine of information. So at that time, through the 1700s and the sort of first half of the 1800s, local government operated within what were called townships. So if you're not aware of these, Heptonstall Township covered the village in Slack and some of the road up to Widdop and down to Blackshaw Head. Stansfield Township covers pretty much Blackshaw Head down to Todmorden. Langfield Township south of that, so around the Mankenholes area. And then you've got Errington Township, which is sort of South Hebden Bridge and the sort of hilltop above that. And then you've got Wadsworth Township kind of to the east and the north of Heptonstall. Now each township elected overseers every year, and there are different functions. So you have the overseer of the poor, whose job it was to look after the poor, operate workhouses, which by the way did exist in the 1700s, and sort of related matters to people's welfare. You had overseers of the highways, whose job it was to make sure highways worked, although it wasn't a very good system because they generally only cared about the roads that mattered to them. You have the constables, so they were, making sure law and order was upheld. And you got the church wardens, whose job it was to, to take account of the fabric and the possessions of the church. Now, Heptonstall's town books are starting around the 1710s. They contain accounts of the varying overseers. The one for the overseers of the poor are particularly good. They contain literally thousands of payments to locals over a century or so, and they generally record the name of the person receiving a payment and where they lived, and then often, not always, what the payment was for. So these payments kind of were usually things like, helping them to pay rent if they're too poor, paying for medicine, for whatever the state of medicine was in the 1700s. They'd often give them raw materials as well. So you might give someone some cloth and say, here you go, you can sell that if you weave it into something useful. It's obviously quite a different system to how we help the less fortunate today, and it's quite an interesting thing to contrast with because it's very hyper-local. They can be quite sad to read through, actually, because sometimes you'll find someone receive medicine help, and then they die, and then there's a few shillings to pay for their coffin and funeral. So that's not great. And then the other townships have some of these town books, but they're not quite as good as the Heptonstall ones. Amongst these town books, or these general records at Halifax Archives, are records of the rates collections. So the owners of properties were generally taxed a proportion of the rental value of the property to pay for the overseers, and we've got a good number of years of those existing, generally, well, roughly from the 1770s, 1780s into around the 1830s, covering who was paying what. Alongside that was the land tax, collected for central government instead, pay for wars and what have you, and also compiling voter registers. So those two records generally go hand in hand. So someone living in the property would pay a whole bunch of taxes for varying things, and they're all generally recorded in sort of in related places in Halifax Archives, although the land tax is searchable on Ancestry. Here there's a collection for them, and you can obviously do that, put in a name, Morley, and you'll find a whole bunch of people, although obviously sometimes not transcribe the best transcriptions, so I do try different combinations of names sometimes. And then Parish records, sorry, where have I got to? Oh, sorry, also to go with the other records of the overseer of the poor, so not just paying accounts out, but they also manage other things, so apprenticeships, so the children of the poor would have to be given a job, essentially, so there's records of those. There's records of what they called bastardy at the time, so if you had an illegitimate child, the mother would declare who the father was, and the father would have to pay maintenance. And then there's records of settlement and removal. So if you wanted to go live in a different township, let's say you want to move from Heptonstall to Ovenden or something, you'd have to have the Heptonstall overseer of the poor write you a certificate saying that if something happens to you, if you lost your job or your hands got cut off or something, that they'd essentially pay for your maintenance. And if you fail to do that and you move to Ovenden and they got wind of this, they generally kick you out and send you back. So there's records of these to some degree. Also the examinations of people, like stating, why do I have a right to live here? Those are extremely useful, because they, people say, oh, my father such and such lived here, and his father lived there, and my uncle, and so on. So those are great where you can find them. Parish church records in the 1700s. You're probably aware they're often a bit lacking in information, so people often hit brick walls when they go, oh, this person doesn't have a baptism. That can often be ascribed to the rise of nonconformism, which, people might say that's sort of kicked off really that's West Yorkshire's fault. The earliest nonconformist groups were known to begin meeting in the area in the late 1600s, and the first dedicated church was opened at Wainsgate as early as 1750. And then just within another 20, 30 years, there are several other churches in the area. And of course, as with parish churches, they'd also kept registers of births or baptisms, depending on the denomination. Obviously, Baptists wouldn't have infant baptism, but they might register the births of the members' children in some cases. And obviously burials, generally burial records start, I think Birchcliffe have some of the earliest surviving burial records, and then some places don't have any, so like Shaw Baptist has a relative lack of existing records. These are pretty much mostly held at the West Yorkshire Archive Service these days. I don't think people at the Yorkshire Baptist Association generally hold them anymore. They might do. Some open churches will have some records. So, for example, Hope Baptist Church, I know, has a membership list going back to their founder back in the 1700s, and they're worth that's worth having a look at. Whilst you're looking at the West Yorkshire Archive Service records they've got for the church, also check out any membership and accounts books they have, because they'll also name and place individuals, and they tend to survive a bit earlier than other registers. And minutes can often give you like a bit of colour into people's lives. You know, such and such was kicked out because they were drinking heavily and fornicating and so on. So those are useful if you're lucky. Of course, if you can't find a baptism record for an individual, maybe they were well, their parents were non-conformists and the register hasn't survived, or maybe they were baptised as an adult, or I think travelling preachers were known to be a thing, but I'm not aware of any surviving records for these travelling preachers. So sometimes you just essentially will never find a baptism record for whatever reason. West Riding Registry of Deeds, founded in the early 1700s. This is at Wakefield Archives, if you've not been. Definitely worth a visit. They contain over 7 million memorials of record sales. These memorials generally name sort of buyers, sellers and witnesses, and also the property under consideration. Because there are 7 million records there, it's not exactly something you can just go into and start browsing. They do have indexes, so there's shelving on the left when you go in, and they have varying degrees of coverage, so better the later you're looking at. For the 1700s, the indexes aren't terribly good, but you know, inquire with them. It's the best way to find people or place if you want to. And there's a thing here on the website just giving you some you know, interesting stuff, some guidance. Heptonstall Manor court rolls. So if you're not aware of what a manor was, a estate of land managed for its owner. The owner was obviously the lord of the manor, and they're managed by courts, and there were sort of varying courts, and the function changed over the centuries. But essentially, we're interested in what was called the court baron, and when the people renting land from the manor would sort of sell or inherit land, they'd have to come before the court and pay some money to do it, and they were initially called copy holders because they held a copy of the court roll saying that, you know, they have rights to do so. And you know, there's a process called enfranchisement in the 1600s, which meant there weren't so many copy holders anymore, and so on and so on. This is in itself probably an hour's discussion telling you about how this whole system works. But the point is, people were at the time a mixture of freeholders and copy holders. The copy holders are actually kind of easier to find because those records are going to be somewhere in the records of Heptonstall Manor. And also they're quite interesting because when people did inherit lands through the manorial system, they would not, I think they weren't allowed to enter this into wills. So if someone wasn't cash rich but they held extensive lands, if you check the manorial court rolls, you might find a whole bunch of people who are not otherwise attested to in wills, or even sometimes I found a whole bunch of people who are not in church records at all, who are my direct ancestors, or at least I believe they are. So the first thing, if you're interested in manorial documents, first thing to do is check on the National Archive website. They have what's called the Manorial Document Register, which I think they established when they disposed of manors when they became extinct in the 1925. And these are all the known records relating to Heptonstall Manor from even before Heptonstall Manor existed. So all of these, and they tell you where they are. So again, Nottinghamshire Archives, and then Yorkshire Archaeological Society ones are at the library in Leeds. Yeah, many of them are in Latin, quite difficult to read, although a lot of them are English or quite easy to read Latin. Might be a future effort by the Hebden Bridge Local History Society or someone to start transcribing these and sell it, you know, put them in a book. And you don't just have Heptonstall Manor, you've also got Stansfield and Wadsworth Manors neighbouring, whose records mostly start in around the early 1600s. And then we got Wakefield Manor court rolls, which I'll talk to you about in a moment, but that's essentially the parent manor to Heptonstall. And then wills prior to 1857, these were registered at church courts. Wills from the area were registered with Pontefract Deanery. There's none of this court peculiar stuff going on with us, so it's all quite simple. If you're interested in finding a will before this date, going back to, I think the earliest will for Heptonstall is something like 1465. And then they sort of really kick off in the 1500s. The originals are held at the Borthwick Institute. They have some guide here on how to find a will, but you can find indexes on Find My Past website. You can search for people and years, and then a medieval genealogy website here, which is quite useful, has a really early somewhere. Here you go, index of wills in the York Registry up to the 1600s. So those are worth a look through to see. You can scan for surnames and so on. I thought we were already there. Okay, sorry. 17th century. Sorry, I'm aware of time. I'll try and get done in the next 5 minutes. 17th century, we're concerned again with church records. So obviously non-conformism wasn't legal yet. Attendance was in theory mandatory. I don't know if that meant you had to baptize and bury people in the church, but it may or may not have. There's obviously a lot less information in this period. So like baptism records are generally the name of the child and the name of the father and not really anything else. And so on, and burials don't give reason for death or, age at death. I would just, well, West Yorkshire Archive Service has a nice guide to parish registers where you can find them. Heptonstalls are available online, so Ancestry and Family Search. Calderdale Family History Society have a series of these transcribed, so these are generally a lot better quality than stuff you'd find on websites like Ancestry, where they struggle a lot with transcriptions from the 1600s, partially due to the sort of handwritten Latin and partially due to the phonetic way in which surnames are spelled. So for example, my name is surname Robert Shaw, spelled Robert Shea until about 1650. So you've got to be a little bit careful about searching for names. We have more wills. Inventories survive from the century, and Hebden Bridge Local History Society, their publications, they've got a few books. So Heptonstall was worth, I think there's a Stansfield and Sorby one floating around there. They're quite interesting, give you a bit of colour on people's lives. Half tax form part of a series, well, the tail end of a series of taxation records naming individuals. Half tax was levied for a couple of decades on the number of fireplaces that you had in your home. There used to be quite a good website for this, but seems to have vanished in recent years. And I think there's some books with transcriptions of them. But if you can get to the National Archives and search through their E179 database, they're quite they're very easy to read. They're just lists of names, and they're really useful. They just name principal. Well, they're pretty much a census. They name the sort of heads of households, including people who are exempt. And then you might have heard of window tax, but as far as I'm aware, there aren't any window tax individual enumerations surviving their sort of groups, so they're not a thing, unfortunately. And then in 1642, just before the start of the Civil War, we have the protestation returns. So Parliament asked all men who are aged 18 or over to sign a document to affirm their support for the Church of England and to support Parliament against what they call popish innovations. So essentially another census of men, although they don't give relationships, they just tell you what township they lived in. So the originals are at Parliamentary Archives. Nowadays, thankfully, you can view them online. So you generally start by finding the page that you're interested in. So Heptonstall page 196, and then you click through and go to page 196, and you'll just be presented with a big long list of names. So that's useful for discovering that people existed. Heptonstall Manor court rolls. So Heptonstall Manor was founded in the 1620s, disrupted in the 1640s, and the rolls only generally survived from 1651, just so you know. And then some other bits and pieces. Lay subsidies I'll talk about in a moment. 1500s, parish records for Heptonstall only survived from the 1590s. If you go back to Halifax, they start a lot earlier, 1530s. Whatever reason, they're supposed to, excuse me, they're supposed to be copied from paper into parchment. That doesn't seem to have happened at Heptonstall, unfortunately. Records of Halifax come Heptonstall Manor. This was the manor that existed prior to Heptonstall Manor. It was founded in around the year 1100 by the Earls of Warren and granted to the Priory of Lewes down in Surrey. The monks there were made the lords of the manor. Unfortunately, there's no medieval rolls known to survive, although I've read, I think, in the Ling-Roth book that supposedly they did. I don't think anyone knows where they are at the moment. It'd be wonderful if they could be found. We do have a series from 1570 up till about 1620, which some of the earliest records we have kind of for the area, and those again, like later manorial records, give names of individuals and relationships. So when someone dies, they give it to their heir, and the heir is named, and so on and so forth. A little bit difficult to go through because they're written in Latin, but there are transcriptions in the Halifax. That's not the right thing. The Halifax Antiquarian Society transactions have some transcriptions of these. So I'll update the website, but there's one of these years I think has transcriptions of these somewhere. I can't find it right now, sorry. But yeah, they've been transcribed. Wakefield Manor court rolls, I'll get to those in a minute, very aware of time. Lay subsidies, tax records, which exist from as early as 1524. The records of the wealthiest individuals of each township, so the threshold was quite high. And these lay subsidies were placed on lay people, so not the clergy, and they're generally to fund the king going off and fighting war in Europe. So the earliest for Heptonstall is 1524. I think Halifax starts a little bit earlier. They're interesting. So although they do only name sort of individuals, they're kind of interesting when taken as a series, because you can generally assume like a continuity of a name or surname, and the amounts they own generally represents like a series of inheritance. And again, these are found at in the E179 database, the National Archives here. So you can search for documents, naming individuals, search, and then bang, there's a big long list of them. Right, and then tithes. There were some tithes collected 5036, probably worth checking that out in the Halifax Antiquarian Society tithe rental article. That's quite an interesting backstory to that, which I don't have time to go into. There's law courts, so people bringing other people to court in the, as early as the 1500s. Some of those records exist at National Archives, and you can search their discovery website, and again, you type in a name, you type in an era, and maybe if your ancestor was involved with one of these, it'll come up in the relevant period. Church courts, so dealing with moral and spiritual matters, so sexual slander and marriage annulments and things. These are recorded in what are called the cause papers here. These are held at Borthwick, and you can search. So if we search for Heptonstall really quickly, you can see there's a bunch of them starting in 1516. These are very difficult to read. They're sort of quite scrawly Latin handwriting, but they're actually quite formulaic. So if you can get hold of some example transcriptions, you can figure it out without too much work. And then conveyance, there's various bits and bobs at West Yorkshire Archive Services, if you're lucky, if you search. And then there's feet of fines, they're called, which medieval genealogy has a list of indexes which are worth a look at. So if you go through some of these, you can search for people's names. They only got to 1625, but I think they ran for another 200 years afterwards. And wills. Medieval, right. Wakefield Manor court rolls. 2 minutes. Individuals from Heptonstall. Well, the major source of medieval family history we have, and actually like local history as well for this period, are the Wakefield Manor court rolls. This was the parent manor to Heptonstall. It was one of the largest in the country. It was supposedly founded pre-Norman times and owned by the Earls of Warren. Its rolls begin in the 13th century and mostly complete for several hundred years afterwards, up until it was abolished in 1925. It does contain more court baron, i.e. inheritance and sale of property for other sub-manors in the area, mostly around Wakefield, but Sorby Manor, if your ancestors live there, you might find them in there. Residents of Upper Calderdale not covered, but we have to be content in what was called the Halifax, the Sheriff's Torn, held at Halifax twice a year at the Moot Hall, formerly near St John's Church. What would happen here twice a year, the Torn, was that the constable of each township would bring criminal cases before a jury. So people who were involved with fighting and brewing and baking without a license, and what other law they'd be broken, they'd sort of be brought up before, and then the perpetrators would be named, shamed and fined, and their names entered into a roll. And like I said, these start in the late 1200s, and I found the earliest mention of my family in the 1380s, and by following through specifically the Heptonstall entries, I managed to form a sort of speculative family tree through the 1400s. These are physically held at Leeds Library Special Collections. Again, written very hard to read medieval Latin, abbreviated Latin, sorry. Yorkshire Archaeological Society has been publishing transcriptions, which you can buy. Some of those you can go onto the archive.org website, follow the link, and then there's some searchable OCR versions of some of their early records. And then just really quickly, military, there's a website called Medieval Soldier. You might be able to find some medieval people. Poll tax of 1379, useful. Some surnames like Cockcroft and my own are missing, but there is a website here, Gen UKI, which has a list of all the people in the 1379 poll tax. Right, so I think I'll just stop now. So yes, those are the major sources of family history. There's obviously some smaller ones which I've skipped over. Some we don't have on here because we're not aware of them. So if you think we've missed anything, please do let us know. Some simply don't exist. So a lot of employment records, for example, just get thrown away when companies close down. But always, check with your local friendly archives first. If you want to know if something exists, then just ask West Yorkshire Archive Services. And again, please, if you if you missed anything that I mentioned, because I had to move quite quickly, do just come back on this website. You'll be able to watch this again on YouTube in a minute, or ask us online on Facebook. And then there's a website called rootschat.com, which is linked to at the top, where you can ask if you have specific questions about your ancestors. Then you can ask them. There's lots of very helpful people on there. So yeah, right. Thank you very much for listening. I guess we can move to if anyone has any questions.